We like to believe the Bible is a book about compassion, about loving your neighbor, feeding the poor, helping the weak. But what if I told you there are people the Bible explicitly says you shouldn't help? Not metaphorically, not symbolically, literally. There are verses that command believers to withhold mercy, to refuse support, to cut people off completely. And here's the uncomfortable part. Most Christians have read these passages. Few have truly faced them. We're not attacking faith, we're examining something deeper. What happens when a sacred text draws a line through certain human beings and calls that righteousness? Because the people it tells you not to help might reveal more about morality than the people it tells you to love. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. Do not even greet them. In the New Testament, in 2 John 1:10, believers are told something chilling. If anyone comes to you and does not bring the correct doctrine, do not receive them into your house. Do not even greet them. That is not poetic exaggeration. It is a boundary drawn with sharp ink. Think about what that means in the ancient world. Hospitality was not optional politeness. It was survival. Homes were shelters for travelers. Meals were protection. To refuse someone entry was not just social distance. It was moral rejection. And the text does not target criminals or violent predators. It targets people who teach something different about Christ. Not criminals, not abusers, not dangerous rebels. People who believe differently. The instruction is not to debate them, not to sit down and reason through disagreements, not to challenge their ideas in public discussion. It is to withhold welcome, to withhold basic social warmth, to avoid even a greeting, which in that culture signaled recognition and peace. Now, pause there. A greeting seems small, but psychologically it is everything. A greeting says you exist, you are human, I acknowledge you. To remove that is to erase someone socially. It transforms disagreement into defilement. And here is the deeper layer. The verse explains that greeting them makes you share in their wicked work. In other words, compassion becomes complicity. Kindness becomes betrayal. A simple act of courtesy becomes moral danger. Ask yourself what that does inside a community. When disagreement is framed as contamination, fear grows. Curiosity shrinks. Questions feel risky. You do not just avoid false teaching. You avoid the teacher. You avoid the person. Over time, that shapes instinct. You learn to flinch from difference. You equate loyalty with distance. And once isolation is labeled righteousness, withholding help feels like obedience. But this was not an isolated instruction buried in a corner of Scripture. It reflects a pattern, and that pattern becomes even harder to ignore as we continue. The apostate rule, Deuteronomy 13, goes further. It does not speak about strangers at the gate or traveling teachers passing through town. It speaks about someone close. If your brother, your son or daughter, the wife you embrace, or your closest friend secretly urges you to follow other gods, the command is clear. You must not yield. You must not listen. You must not shield them. Your hand shall be first against them. This is not symbolic language about ignoring bad advice. In its historical setting, it meant execution. The one who reported the apostasy was expected to initiate the punishment. Loyalty to God was proven through participation. Now pause and bring that into human terms. Imagine your child comes home from university and says they no longer believe. Imagine your spouse begins to question the faith you built your life around. Imagine your closest friend confesses doubt in private. The ancient command does not say, sit with them patiently. It does not say, try to understand. It says, do not listen, do not spare, do not conceal. This is where the moral tension tightens, because the text places divine allegiance above every natural bond. Blood does not outrank belief. Marriage does not outrank doctrine. Friendship does not outrank fidelity to God. The highest virtue becomes separation from the one who strays. And here is the unsettling part. The passage frames this severity as protection. It assumes that false worship spreads like infection. If one person turns, others may follow. So, compassion toward the doubter becomes cruelty toward the community. Mercy toward the individual becomes betrayal of the collective. That logic is powerful. It transforms love into liability. It recasts empathy as weakness. It teaches that the purest devotion may require you to override your most human instincts. This is not just about punishment. It is about redefining compassion itself. When faith is positioned above empathy, obedience can demand emotional violence. You silence your grief. You harden your heart. You convince yourself that firmness is love. So, ask the question slowly. When faith becomes higher than empathy, who gets sacrificed first? The rebel, the relationship, or something inside you? And this pattern does not end here. It deepens. The idle should not eat. In 2 Thessalonians 3:10, Paul writes a sentence that has echoed for centuries. If anyone is not willing to work, let him not eat. It sounds straightforward, even responsible. On the surface, it feels like common sense. A community cannot survive if everyone refuses to contribute. And in its original context, Paul was addressing a specific problem. Some believers expected the imminent return of Christ and had stopped working altogether. They were relying on others to feed them while they waited. The instruction was aimed at restoring order, not punishing the vulnerable. But here is where things become complicated. Over time, that single line escaped its narrow setting. It became a slogan, a principle, a moral filter. Because everything hinges on one word: willing. Who decides who is willing? The person who cannot find work. The person battling depression who can barely get out of bed. The single parent drowning in exhaustion. The disabled man whose limitations are invisible. The anxious woman paralyzed by fear. Are they unwilling or unable? When a community begins to sort people into categories of deserving and undeserving, something subtle shifts. Compassion becomes conditional. Help becomes earned. Aid becomes proof of virtue rather than response to need. And once mercy has prerequisites, it stops being mercy. It becomes a transaction. You work, you eat. You fail, you hunger. The moral burden moves from the helper to the struggling person. History shows how easily this verse has been used to justify cutting welfare, ignoring poverty, or dismissing suffering as laziness. A line meant to address disorder in one church becomes a tool to rationalize indifference on a massive scale. Now consider the psychological effect. If you are struggling and you hear this verse repeated, you may begin to doubt your own pain. You may internalize shame. You may believe your hardship disqualifies you from help. And that is the deeper tension. When sacred text defines who deserves to eat, survival becomes tied to moral judgment. But perhaps the most unsettling example is not about productivity or doctrine at all. It reaches closer. It reaches into the structure of family itself. Hate your father and mother. In Luke 14:26, Jesus says something that has unsettled readers for centuries. If anyone comes to me and does not hate his father and mother, he cannot be my disciple. The wording is sharp, jarring, almost impossible to hear without tension. Scholars often explain that the word translated as hate can mean to love less by comparison. In that cultural context, it may have been a way of expressing priority rather than emotional hostility. But even with that clarification, the core message remains intense. Loyalty to Jesus must come before every other bond. Before family, before marriage, before children. That is not a casual statement. In the ancient world, family was identity. It was security, inheritance, survival. To suggest that devotion to a spiritual path should outrank those ties was revolutionary. It restructured the hierarchy of love. Now, bring that into human experience. Imagine a son choosing faith in a way his parents do not understand. Imagine a daughter pursuing belief that creates tension at home. Imagine a spouse who feels second to a religious calling. The teaching implies that when conflict arises, allegiance to Christ takes precedence. This is where the emotional weight sits. When spiritual devotion outranks human connection, there will always be moments of fracture. Not necessarily violence, not necessarily cruelty, but distance, division, hard choices that feel like loss. History carries examples of families strained by belief differences, parents and children who drift apart, communities that separate from members who step outside accepted doctrine. Often, those choices were framed as faithfulness. Obedience was seen as strength. And that reframing matters, because when sacrifice is labeled virtue, pain can be spiritualized. Separation can feel righteous. The cost becomes proof of commitment. The deeper question is not whether devotion requires priority. Many commitments do. The deeper question is how we balance conviction with compassion, how we hold belief without dissolving the bonds that make us human. And this tension between allegiance and empathy does not disappear as the text continues. In some passages, it expands even further. The harem principle. In parts of the Old Testament, we encounter a concept known as harem. It is often translated as something devoted completely to God, sometimes through destruction. Certain groups in the conquest narratives were described as falling under this category. The language is sweeping. Men, women, children, livestock, entire cities marked off. There were to be no treaties, no intermarriage, no integration. The command was not framed as negotiation or gradual reform. It was framed as obedience. It is important to acknowledge context. These texts emerge from an ancient Near Eastern world shaped by tribal warfare, territorial conflict, and survival anxieties. Many historians argue the language may reflect hyperbolic war rhetoric common in that era. Others see theological storytelling layered onto complex historical realities. Interpretation varies. But the moral structure presented in the narrative is stark. If a people are designated outside the covenant, they are positioned outside protection, outside mercy, outside alliance. And that framework carries weight beyond its historical setting, because it introduces a powerful template. There are insiders, there are outsiders. There are those within the boundary of sacred concern and those beyond it. Once a group is described as spiritually corrupt or existentially threatening, compassion becomes complicated. Assistance can be portrayed as compromise. Kindness can be reframed as disloyalty. The highest virtue becomes separation. You can see how this logic functions psychologically. It simplifies the world. It reduces moral ambiguity. It tells a community exactly where sympathy should and should not flow. The danger is not confined to ancient battlefields. The underlying pattern can reappear whenever a group is labeled impure, dangerous, or fundamentally opposed to what is sacred. When that label sticks, withholding help can feel justified, even necessary. And that idea, once embedded in moral imagination, does not remain contained in one era. It echoes forward. Helping outsiders. Throughout history, some Christian communities have prioritized caring for their own. Food programs organized around church membership, financial assistance directed first to fellow believers. Support networks built primarily for those inside the fold. In many cases, this was about survival. Early Christians were marginalized minorities. Mutual aid kept them alive. It is also true that countless churches today extend generosity far beyond their walls. Hospitals, disaster relief, global aid, community outreach, many believers reject any narrow boundary around compassion. That reality deserves acknowledgement. But the theological tension remains embedded in certain texts. In Galatians 6:10, Paul writes, "Do good to all people, especially to those who belong to the household of faith." At first glance, that seems balanced. Good to all. Priority to believers. Yet that single word, especially, carries weight. It creates an inner ring, a center of gravity, a hierarchy of concern. And whenever there is an inner ring, there is also an outer one. This is not about denying that Christians help broadly. Many do. The deeper issue is structural. When belief becomes a factor in determining priority, worth begins to intersect with doctrine. Aid is no longer based solely on need. It is filtered through belonging. Psychologically, this makes sense. Humans are wired for tribe. We protect those who share our identity. We invest in those who reinforce our worldview. Theology, can sanctify that instinct. It can elevate it from preference to principle. But once compassion is organized around shared belief, a subtle shift occurs. Outsiders may still receive help, but insiders receive preference. Over time, that preference can harden. It can justify neglect. It can frame limited resources as reason to focus inward. The tension is not about generosity versus stinginess. It is about moral architecture, who stands at the center, who waits at the edges, and who decides. Because when theology defines priority, compassion risks becoming tribal. And that is where the question sharpens. The psychological cost. Here's the deeper issue. When a sacred text instructs you to limit help towards certain people, it does more than regulate behavior. It shapes instinct. It trains your internal compass. At first, the tension is obvious. You feel the pull of empathy on one side and the pull of obedience on the other. There is friction, a quiet discomfort. But when obedience is framed as virtue, and virtue is framed as loyalty to God, the equation begins to shift. Goodness becomes alignment with command, and if the command includes exclusion, exclusion starts to feel moral. Over time, repetition normalizes it. You hear the verse in sermons, you see it modeled in community life, you watch respected leaders draw lines with confidence. Gradually, the discomfort fades. What once felt harsh begins to feel principled. What once felt like withholding becomes framed as protecting truth. This is how moral reframing works. You do not wake up intending to suppress compassion. You convince yourself that you are preserving something higher. Withholding help is no longer cruelty in your mind. It becomes faithfulness. It becomes strength. And the shift is subtle. So subtle that you rarely notice it happening. The human brain is built for belonging. We are wired to protect our group. Shared boundaries create cohesion. Clear lines reduce uncertainty. When a community agrees on who stands outside, unity inside intensifies. Nothing bonds a group faster than defining what it is not. But that bonding has a cost, because every line that strengthens identity also narrows empathy. Every exclusion that clarifies doctrine also risks hardening the heart. The real question is not whether communities need boundaries. Most do. The real question is what happens to our moral imagination when sacred authority blesses those boundaries. At what point does loyalty begin to override compassion, and how do we know when that line has been crossed? That is the hardest question of all. What is morality based on? Now we arrive at the core tension beneath all of this. What is morality actually grounded in? Is it loyalty to authority? Or is it the reduction of harm? Is goodness defined by obedience to command? Or by the well-being of conscious beings? When a sacred instruction appears to conflict with empathy, something inside us reacts. You feel it. A quiet hesitation, a moral friction. The text says one thing, your conscience whispers another. Which one wins? That question sits at the center of this entire conversation. Because history shows that many believers do not simply apply these difficult passages at face value. They reinterpret them. They place them in historical context. They argue for metaphor. They highlight cultural distance. They spiritualize what sounds literal. And that effort is revealing. It suggests that moral intuition is active. It suggests that something within us evaluates the text rather than passively absorbing it. When a verse feels misaligned with compassion, we search for ways to reconcile it. We soften the edges. We frame it as descriptive rather than prescriptive. We refuse to extend its logic into modern life. Why? Because deep down, most of us hold an assumption that compassion should not be restricted by tribe. We sense that suffering matters regardless of belief. We feel that need itself creates a claim on us. That instinct does not emerge from exclusion. It emerges from empathy, from the ability to imagine another person's pain as real, from recognizing shared vulnerability. So perhaps the deeper issue is not whether ancient texts contain boundaries. Many traditions do. The deeper issue is how we decide which moral voice carries ultimate weight. The written command, or the human capacity for care. And once you recognize that tension, you cannot avoid the final implication. What does it mean if our conscience sometimes pushes beyond our scripture? The Bible contains profound wisdom, poetry, hope, beauty. It has inspired courage, sacrifice, and acts of extraordinary compassion. But it also contains boundaries, lines that separate, commands that exclude, verses that appear to narrow the flow of mercy. The question is not whether those passages exist. They do. The real question is how we interpret them and how we allow them to shape us. Do we let ancient lines define modern compassion? Or do we allow empathy, expanded by experience and reflection, to guide how we treat other human beings? Because the people a text tells you not to help are often the clearest test of your moral framework. If goodness depends on who stands inside your circle, then your circle defines your ethics. But if goodness reaches beyond doctrine, beyond tribe, beyond inherited fear, then compassion becomes something larger than loyalty. And that may be the most challenging path of all. If you value truth over comfort, continue questioning, think carefully, and take responsibility for your conscience.